So get us back on track of the invertebrates that we're looking at of this particular grouping. We're looking at mollusks, and we're only going to look at 4 of the major classes of mollusks just to get a kind of an overview and give you some examples that maybe you're already familiar with. Of the 4 major classes, we're going to look at Polyplecophora. Polyplecophores are the chitons. Then we're going to look at the gastropods, the gastropoda, snails and slugs, the bivalves, which will be your clams, oysters, and other bivalves. Cephalopoda, the cephalopods are the squids, the octopus, the cuttlefish, and the chambered nautilus. Some of those you're probably familiar with or have heard of before. Let's start with the chitons. Chitons can be found if you've ever gone to the seashore at low tide. You can find these little guys clinging to damp rocks at the ocean's low tide. They're usually sort of oval-shaped marine animals encased in an armor of 8 dorsal plates, and they use their foot as a suction cup to kind of grip to the rocks, and their radula to kind of scrape algae off of the wet rocks of the rock surface here. So there's a good example of a chiton that you could find at the seashore, particularly at low tide if you look in the tide pools there. The next group there is the gastropods. You're probably familiar with these guys. This would be everything from land snails and slugs to sea slugs. Here we have 2 pictures of a land snail, and then here's a sea slug called a nudibranch. About 3/4 of all living species of mollusks are gastropods, so there's a tremendous variety of gastropods. I think we have some video of some of the various sea slugs and land gastropods in the folder. Most gastropods are actually marine, but we're probably familiar with some of the freshwater and terrestrial species. The most distinctive characteristic of gastropods is something called torsion. And torsion is a developmental process in which their body visceral mass twists in development, and it causes the animal's anus and mantle to end up above its head. So there is a twisting of the internal visceral mass in development, and this torsion is not the same as the coiling of a shell. That's a different process, but all gastropods have this twisting to where the internal mass, it gets twisted, as you can see here, and basically that means that their anus ends up higher than their head, which I don't know about you, but I don't think that sounds very pleasant. But there you go, that's a gastropod for you, how their basic layout is and what this torsion means for their internal visceral mass. Look, there's a gastropod right there. So most have a single spiraled shell, and there are some that have no shell, like slugs, or some that have a very reduced shell. Gastropods, very common within the water. So for example, here is one without a shell, a marine gastropod. And then of course you're familiar probably with snails and slugs, which are another form of gastropod. They do have eyes, like you'll notice they have stalks. If you look closely, there'll be little eye spots at the end of the stalks, and pretty cool little creatures. And they usually walk along on their little muscular foot and leave behind kind of a slimy trail behind them. The next group of mollusks are called bivalves. Bivalves are your clams, oysters, mussels, scallops. They are marine, and for the most part they're marine. There are some freshwater versions too, and they have a lot of different species. They have a shell that's divided into 2 halves, drawn together by some very strong muscles. Some of the bivalves actually do have simple eyes and sensory tentacles along the edge of their mantles, and the mantle cavity of a bivalve contains gills that allow them to breathe in the water, exchange gases, as well as to collect food materials from the water around them. So here is a bivalve right there in front of you. Oftentimes if you eat clams or oysters, you don't really think about what they look like when they're alive and moving around. So here is one right there, very nice shot taken from the ocean. And then if we looked at their internal organs, again you see a much greater complexity than some of the other creatures we've looked at. They have a separate mouth and anus. They have this muscular foot. They have an internal visceral mass. It's surrounded by a shell. They have the ability to pull water in and to expel water, to kind of scoot around through the ocean and that type of thing. So much more complex than some of the other creatures that we've looked at. Finally, moving on to the most complex of the mollusks, this will be the cephalopods. Cephalopods are by far the most intelligent and complex of the mollusks and creatures we've looked at thus far. They're carnivores. They have beak-like jaws surrounded by tentacles, which is basically their modified foot. The mantle covers the visceral mass of most, and the shell is reduced, internal, or missing altogether in most cephalopods. So most cephalopods, like an octopus or a squid, don't have a shell. They do have a mantle, which is that hard outside covering. When you look at the octopus, you would kind of think of it as his head, and that covers most of their visceral mass. Cephalopods are often considered the most intelligent of all invertebrates, bar none. If you were to go online and look up various videos of particularly the octopus, they are quite intelligent. They are escape artists. They are very well known for escaping from tanks and aquariums, and for finding food and opening jars and doing all sorts of amazing things that you wouldn't think that such a seemingly basic creature could do, but they are very intelligent. Most octopus creep along the sea floor in search of prey using their tentacles as both feet and hands, and they are also masters of disguise and masters of camouflage, and they oftentimes can change the coloration of their body to match their environment. So here we have a squid, which primarily will they have a valve system similar to the bivalves that can shoot water out, and they can move quite quickly through the water using jets of propulsion water. So a squid, here we have an octopus who uses his tentacles oftentimes as arms or feet. And then we have one of the few shelled versions of this type of creature, the chambered nautilus, which is very similar to some of the more ancient fossilized forms that we find. So again, the octopus here's his mantle, his visceral mass. It actually looks like a huge brain, but this is his visceral mass where all his internal organs are. Very intelligent invertebrate. The squid, very fast swimmer, can use jets of water which siphon in and then expel jets of water to allow them to swim very quickly. And then again, one of the few remaining shelled cephalopods, the nautilus, although there used to be quite a few more of them back in ancient times. Cephalopods have a closed circulatory system, well-developed sense organs, complex brain, so we're getting more and more complex as we kind of go up the ladder here. And again, I talked about the nautilus there is very similar to some ancient forms of life, some shelled cephalopods called ammonites. Ammonites were very common in the dinosaur time, but they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, about the same time that the dinosaurs were wiped out, about 65 million years ago. I happen to have a very nice fossilized fossil of an ammonite. They're actually fairly common. This one is about the size of a large dinner plate, but I have seen some as small as a dime and some larger than a 6-foot person, 6 foot in diameter. So these ammonites would look very similar to a chambered nautilus, but they were in great abundance after the Cambrian explosion, and they died out for the most part about the same time the dinosaurs did. So a good example I have sitting right there in my living room. Another important reason for us to take a look at the mollusks is because they are a very good indicator species. When the pollution levels get high and the environment begins to degrade, oftentimes it's mollusks that are the first to go extinct, and they are the animal group with the largest number of recent extinctions. The most threatened groups are freshwater bivalves, including pearl mussels, and terrestrial gastropods, different types of snails, including Pacific Island land snails, and these mollusks are threatened by the usual suspects: habitat loss, pollution, non-native species invasion, and the like. So we want to look at these mollusks sort of as indicator species to tell us how the environment is doing, because we are losing tremendous amounts of diversity in this particular group due to extinction. Let's go ahead and look at the next group that we want to look at, which are called annelids. Oops, back it up just a little bit there. We're still in this category of Lophotrichozoa. They are all bilateral creatures, but we're still in this category. We just talked about the mollusks, and now we're going to go on to the annelids. Annelids have bodies composed of a series of fused rings. They are coelomates, so they have a true body cavity that's formed from the mesoderm material. And the phylum Annelida is divided into two groups, the polychaetes and the Oligochaeta. Boy, again with the words here. Oligochaeta. So the polychaetes we'll take a look at. The Oligochaeta you're probably familiar with. They are the earthworms, and their relatives, the leeches. So the polychaeta, The polychaetes are mostly marine. This would include the Christmas tree worm that we looked at the very beginning of the chapter. So here's a couple of beautiful, we looked at a red version, but here's a yellow and blue. They totally do not look like living creatures. They look like something out of a cartoon. And then here are some tube worms that oftentimes live near vents, oceanic volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean floor. The polychaeta have paddle-like parapodia. These parapodia, remember podia is foot, so this is kind of like a foot-like structure, and it has these little feathery portions that you see, these gills. They help it move, they help it gather food, they help it with gas exchange. And so polychaetes would be like the Christmas tree worm and the tube worms that you see here, and most of them are marine. They live in the ocean. And I think there's a video if you want to look. Tube worms are very well known because they live very close to various volcanic thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. The oligochaetes are named for the relatively sparse chaeta, or bristles made of chitin, so kind of like a version of hair, I guess you could say, but they have little bristles on their body made up of chitin. Earthworms are probably the best known example. Earthworms very good for the environment. They eat through the soil, extracting nutrients as the soil moves through their digestive system, their alimentary canal. Earthworms are hermaphrodites, but they do cross-fertilize with one another. Some reproduce asexually by fragmentation. So again, we still have a fairly simple way of reproducing here. Earthworms can be seen in some videos, I believe I have, in the Chapter 33 folder there. And again, if we were to take a look at an earthworm, we would see that it's probably more complex than you thought it was. They do have some simple intestines. They are coelomates. They are tripoblastic. They do have 3 layers of tissue. They do have a separate mouth and anus. I wouldn't say they necessarily have much of a brain, but they do have a very simple nervous system, and then they have these little hairs of chitin that you see, which is where their name comes from. So most earthworms that we see here in the United States are fairly small, but they can grow fairly large. I mean, look at this giant Australian earthworm. I think if I found an earthworm that size, I would probably run the other direction. I'm not so sure I'd want to put that on a hook and go fishing with it. But they're probably more complex than you thought, and earthworm dissection is something that's commonly done in biology class. Related to earthworms would be our leeches. Most species of leeches live in fresh water, but a few of them are marine or terrestrial. Leeches tend to be parasitic. They include predators of invertebrates and parasites that suck blood. Leeches attach to a host and secrete a chemical called hirudin to prevent blood from coagulating. So they actually inject a chemical into you, much like mosquitoes do, to keep your blood flowing so they can continue to suck the blood from the body. And here's a leech who has attached himself to the finger of a scientist or researcher. I don't know if I'd be willing to do that, but I guess if you're a true scientist, you're almost willing to do anything. So unlike an earthworm that eats its way through soil, a leech, or many varieties of leeches, are parasitic, and they attach to a host, whether it's a fish or some other creature, and they basically survive by removing blood and digesting the blood of their host. We're going to stop right there, and we're going to move on to the next group of creatures. I know this is a huge number and variety, but again, we're trying to stick with just the basic kind of overview, and I won't expect you to know small details about every single one of these creatures. We'll take a break. We'll be right back.